Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. My name is Bob Bianchi. I will be here till 3 o'clock. We got a lot on the plate. A terrible tragedy occurred yesterday. Life is so fleeting. You never know when you're going to have it and when you're not. That's why I always say live every day to the fullest, because you never know when your time comes. And I'm speaking specifically about the tragedy with Kobe Bryant and the helicopter crash, where all those individuals, including his 13-year-old daughter, you see her there on the clip right there, was killed as well. It's really a terrible, terrible tragedy. But I am very honored to have Andrew Maloney with me. This guy is a preeminent aviation expert attorney. He knows his stuff. He knows his way around this kind of stuff. His law practice is in New York. And I really appreciate you coming in here on short notice to talk to us about this case, Andrew.
Sure, Bob. It looks like weather played a role here. I think the fog, the conditions, the visibility conditions were very poor. The LAPD had grounded its fleet. Now they may have a different mission profile than the helicopter that Mr. Bryant was flying on, but clearly there was a weather issue. This pilot did have training in what we call instrument flight rules. That's somebody who is trained to fly in low visibility weather, but it's always dangerous to do that. You get spatial disorientation, which is what it looks like occurred here.
Now, Andrew, if I've got the facts right here, what I understand is that they grounded the police helicopters and emergency services helicopters because of the weather conditions, but the rules vary greatly with respect to whether it's a public entity or a private entity. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, the police have very strict protocols and criteria when they can fly and when they can't fly. And they have a different mission profile because police, if their mission is to fly at building level, for example, that's a different kind of flight mission than you would get on a commercial helicopter like Mr. Bryant's helicopter. They're not going to do those certain things. So it is certainly an issue that the LAPD was not flying yesterday because of the bad weather, but it's not dispositive because in the commercial world, they don't have the same flight criteria. Maybe they should be more conservative, but they don't have the same mission profile. So there is an argument that they could still be permitted to fly and fly safely if they know what they're doing.
So let me see if I have this straight. So an emergency services helicopter by the government, whether it be EMS or a police that are responding to actual emergencies, have more standards and requirements with regard to flying than a private company would. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. I would tell you that the EMS, the flight evacuation helicopters, often they have strict criteria, but there is some pilot judgment there. A lot of times if it's to save a life, you weigh the risks, just like a firefighter going into a burning building. It's not the smartest thing to do, but if there's a life in danger, they may be able to push the limits there. But typically, they do have mission profiles and criteria that prohibit them from putting themselves in harm's way.
Yeah, Andrew, talk to me a little bit about, just because it's been taught a lot, and I'm not sure if I've got it down, about when you're flying in this kind of weather, you go, instead of having sight, which is your gauge, you have to fly by the instruments. And how much more difficult is that?
It is exponentially more difficult. You have to have a lot of training and pass certification tests to be qualified to do that. Because if you're relying on your instruments, you have to ignore what your eyes and ears are telling you. I brought a prop, if you will. This is actually a Jet Ranger, a Bell helicopter. It's not the same type of helicopter as the Sikorsky S-76 that they were flying, but it's very similar in shape. I think the S-76 has 4 blades instead of 2, but it looks pretty similar to this. And when a pilot is flying straight along and he sees fog or clouds ahead of him, he should probably try to avoid that. But if you do fly into it, you really are supposed to only do that if you have instrument training, because once you get inside, it's like a total blackout condition, and you can't see what's up and what's down. You would think you think your inner ear is telling you, oh, I'm in level flight, I'm looking at my compass, I'm staying on my heading. But a slight variation, a slight turn like this, you may not feel in a helicopter or an airplane. And if you're in a slight turn, you're starting to move, and you're also descending. So if you're in an area where you need to maintain your altitude, like in a mountainous terrain, which is where this accident happened, you may be losing altitude and not realizing it if you're looking out your window instead of looking at your altimeter. And in that environment that he was in, the altimeter is actually changing all the time because the terrain is sloping. If you're in a mountainous area and you're close to those mountains, 1 second you could be 1,000 feet above terrain, And just to your right, really only a few hundred yards away, you could only be 100 feet off the terrain because the mountain is sloping down. And if you can't see it, it's extremely dangerous.
You know, one of the things I love about being a trial lawyer is that you get to work with experts, and after a while, like yourself, and been doing this for so long, you're almost an expert as like an aviator because you have to know it inside and out. There have been some people that have opined that there may have been a mechanical error because the plane, the helicopter rather, had been making tight circles around and around. What is the accident debris that we see there on the TV right now telling you? I know it's subjective and you got a lot more to go, but what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm thinking the helicopter hit the terrain at high speed, forward speed, because the terrain is, the wreckage is spread out over the terrain over at least 100 or more yards. The helicopter did not come straight down. Everybody knows a helicopter can land straight down. And in fact, if there was an engine failure, you can do an auto rotation and the blades continue to rotate and act like a parachute to come down. That's not what this debris field is telling me. This debris field is telling me that helicopter hit it at a high speed. The aircraft, the S-76, can go about 175 miles an hour. And even if he was only doing 100 miles an hour, you hit the ground at a substantial impact, and that spreads out the wreckage along the mountainside, which is what it looks like we're seeing now.
Well, it's interesting. Like I said, you have to become a subject matter expert in order to be a lawyer, to be able to evaluate the value of a case if there is a civil case, and then go into a courtroom and try to convince jurors. So like medical malpractice attorneys or myself as a criminal trial attorney, you have to work with a lot of experts. So let me ask you the question, since you're a lawyer. Do you see any civil liability here, or can you tell us in what instances, if somebody had come to you, somebody from the victim's family, and said, I'm interested in pursuing a lawsuit, what you would be doing?
Yeah, there's definitely civil liability. This is not an act of God. This is not an act of nature. This is what appears to be pilot error. I mean, the NTSB is going to examine the wreckage. They're going to examine all the evidence that they can get their hands on, and through a process of elimination, they'll look at any potential mechanical issues. You described the helicopter circling. To me, that says the pilot's disoriented. It doesn't say that there is a problem with the helicopter, but they'll look at that. They'll look at the blades. We've had cases, my firm has had helicopter cases where they've thrown a blade and that causes a catastrophic failure. It changes the center of gravity for the helicopter and it'll go down fast. So they're gonna look at those things. They should be able to eliminate that stuff fairly quickly. There's probably no black box. It's possible some of the commercial helicopters do have black boxes, but in the unlikely event that they had a black box, or they won't be able to get a data recorder to use like you would in a big commercial airliner. But there's going to be enough information from the wreckage that they find to more than likely be able to rule in or rule out a mechanical problem. So we are right now talking about what is most obvious, and to me, it looks like a pilot error issue.
Okay, and if from a lawyer's perspective, if it is a pilot error issue, you would say that there's civil liability. How does that translate into liability with the company?
So if the pilot is responsible for the accident, pilot error, his employer, whoever employed him and owned the helicopter, will have potential civil liability. The employer, through vicarious liability for their employee, the acts of their employees, is also negligent, and they would hopefully have a lot of insurance here.
Okay, so this is a federal. It would be based in a federal laws, I would assume. Or are there state laws?
Yeah, there are federal laws. There are federal aviation regulations that will apply to pilot conduct, his training, things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be brought in a federal courtroom. In this case, it may or may not. There are different types of jurisdiction to get into federal court. This may or may not warrant a federal case as opposed to a superior court of California. It may end up in federal court. Most aviation cases do, but just because there are federal aviation regulations at play doesn't mean it's going to necessarily end up in a federal court.
Okay, so there's rules and regulations with regard to how they're supposed to fly these helicopters and things of that nature, so that will be looked at.
Yes.
And then you said that there are various statutes and rules that are at play. Give me an idea of some of those statutes.
Yeah, so the FARs, they're the federal aviation regulations, govern pilot conduct, what pilots are supposed to do and not do. Essentially, they're supposed to use reasonable care under the circumstances. That's the general negligence standard that applies in every industry. But in the federal aviation regulations, they do talk about weather. They do talk about avoiding bad weather. They do talk about what to do if you're in bad weather. And they talk about the necessary training and certification that you need to fly if you're going to go into what we call instrument flight rules, where you have fog or clouds flying into bad weather. It looks like this pilot had that kind of training, but it's always, in my opinion, a mistake to fly into weather like that if you don't have to.
Okay, I'm told I got one question, so it's going to be bifurcated. So it's really going to be two questions, just so the producers know it's really one question. Is when you say vicarious liability, I just want to make sure it's what they call an agency theory. In other words, if your employee is responsible for negligence, therefore the company would be. Is that what's happening?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and as far as you're concerned, there's, in our law in Jersey, there's a rule that says the mere happening of an accident does not necessarily establish negligence. Is that kind of the same here?
Yeah, that's always true in every case. That's where you need expert aviation lawyers like myself and my partners at my firm that specialize in areas like this, because we do have to prove what was negligent, what he did here and what he shouldn't have done here, and why it caused the accident. So in any negligence case, you have to show that there was a breach of a duty of care, and that's to act reasonable under the circumstances or a violation of a federal aviation regulation. The second, that violation, that duty, that breach of that duty proximately caused injury. And then, of course, the last part is the damages that are related to the accident.
Excellent.
So just because there was an accident doesn't mean there's liability. That has to be proven, and that's what I do.
If the case came across your desk, would you take it? Yes or no?
Absolutely.
Okay, absolutely. I want to thank you so much. Andrew Maloney is an expert in aviation law. His firm has handled the big cases. Check him out on his website. Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate it.
No problem.
All right. Well, listen, here at the Law and Crime Network, we still got a lot more going, folks. And for those that are in our chat room, our loyal followers, I'm about to get there in a minute to say hello to you. Happy Monday again. We're going to go to break. We'll be right back.